What if I told you that scientists can now predict, with 87% accuracy, whether someone is having a mystical experience just by looking at their brain scan? At Johns Hopkins University, researchers have isolated the exact neural signatures of encounters with the divine. They've mapped the brain states of people meeting God, experiencing cosmic consciousness, and dissolving into pure awareness. And what they're finding is rewriting everything we thought we knew about the nature of reality itself. A single dose of psilocybin, administered under clinical conditions, produces mystical experiences that are neurologically identical to those reported by saints and mystics throughout history. Today, we're diving into the most profound question science has ever attempted to answer. What happens in your brain when you touch the infinite? By the end of this video, you'll understand why the line between neuroscience and mysticism is dissolving, and why that might change everything we believe about consciousness, God, and the nature of existence itself. Today, we're exploring what researchers call mystical experience, a scientifically measurable state of consciousness that's been reported across every culture and every century of human history. We're not talking about belief or faith. We're talking about repeatable, quantifiable brain states that can be induced and studied in laboratory conditions. This is where ancient wisdom meets cutting-edge neuroscience, so we're breaking this down into 3 parts. First, we'll examine what actually happens in your brain during mystical states. The neuroscience is extraordinary. Then, we'll explore how these lab-induced experiences compare to traditional mystical encounters throughout history. And finally, we'll look at what this research is revealing about the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. 6 hours after taking a precisely measured dose of synthetic psilocybin, Michael reported what he described as direct contact with the source of all existence. He experienced complete ego dissolution, encountered what he perceived as divine intelligence, and returned with what he called absolute knowledge that consciousness is fundamental to reality. Now here's what's remarkable. Michael's brain scan during this experience showed a pattern that Dr. Griffiths had seen hundreds of times before. Decreased activity in the default mode network, increased connectivity between normally separate brain regions, and most intriguingly, gamma wave patterns identical to those found in Tibetan monks during deep meditation. But Michael's experience raised a troubling question. If mystical experiences are just brain chemistry, why do people consistently report encountering the same fundamental insights? And why do these chemically induced experiences produce lasting psychological changes identical to traditional spiritual awakening? Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial College London has been studying this paradox for over a decade. His research on DMT, psilocybin, and LSD reveals something extraordinary. These molecules don't add anything to brain function, they subtract from it. What we experience as mystical consciousness isn't the result of increased brain activity, but decreased brain activity. Specifically, the suppression of what neuroscientists call the default mode network, the brain regions responsible for self-referential thinking, time perception, and the sense of being a separate self. But here's where it gets weird. When these inhibitory networks shut down, people don't report diminished consciousness. They report expanded consciousness. They describe accessing information and perspectives that seem impossible given the reduced brain activity. This paradox gets even stranger when we look at the data. To study mystical experiences scientifically, researchers developed the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, a precise instrument that measures 6 core components that appear across all authentic mystical encounters, regardless of cultural or religious background. First, unity or oneness, the experience of all separation being illusory. Second, transcendence of time and space. Third, deeply felt positive mood. Fourth, sacredness, encountering something holy or divine. Fifth, noetic quality, receiving knowledge or insight that feels absolutely true. And sixth, ineffability, the sense that the experience cannot be adequately described in words. What's remarkable is that when someone scores above 60% on this questionnaire, they show identical brain patterns regardless of whether their experience came from meditation, prayer, psychedelics, or spontaneous mystical emergence. The neural signature is the same. Dr. Griffith's long-term studies show that people who have high-score mystical experiences, even just once, report permanent increases in openness, empathy, and what psychologists call nature-relatedness. Their personality changes measurably toward what we typically associate with spiritual wisdom. But if the brain signature is universal, what does that tell us about reality itself? For decades, scholars have debated whether different mystical traditions are describing the same experience or culturally specific phenomena. Now, neuroscience is providing a definitive answer. Dr. Andrew Newberg's SPECT scan studies of Franciscan nuns, Tibetan monks, and Sufi practitioners show identical patterns of brain activity during their peak spiritual experiences. The same regions deactivate, the same networks integrate, the same neural signatures emerge. What Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy, the idea that all mystical traditions point to the same ultimate reality, now has neurological validation. The brain doesn't distinguish between Christian ecstasy, Buddhist emptiness, or Hindu samadhi. At the neural level, they're the same state. But ancient traditions knew something modern science is just discovering. Traditional mystical texts contain remarkably precise descriptions of what we now know are specific brain states. The Sufi poet Rumi's descriptions of fana, ego dissolution, match perfectly with what modern neuroscience observes during default mode network suppression. Hindu texts describe 8 stages of samadhi, and each stage corresponds to measurable changes in brain wave patterns, neurotransmitter levels, and network connectivity. They were essentially creating neuroscience maps 3,000 years before we had the technology to validate them. Dr. Enzo Tagliazucchi's recent research using advanced neuroimaging has revealed something extraordinary about the mystical brain state. During peak mystical experiences, the brain exhibits what's called neural criticality, a state right at the edge of chaos where maximum information integration occurs. Think of it like this. Your normal waking consciousness operates with a lot of neural noise and compartmentalization. Different brain regions work somewhat independently. But during mystical states, the brain reorganizes into what researchers call a hyper-connected state, where distant regions communicate directly. This creates what Dr. Carhart Harris terms increased neural entropy. Your brain processes vastly more information than usual, but in patterns that normal waking consciousness can't sustain. And here's where it gets really interesting. Some researchers are proposing that these hyperconnected brain states might actually be accessing what physicist David Bohm called the implicate order, underlying informational structures that normal consciousness filters out. Dr. Stuart Hameroff and Sir Roger Penrose's research on quantum consciousness suggests that mystical states might involve quantum coherence in neural microtubules, essentially, your brain temporarily operating according to quantum rather than classical physics. But this creates what philosophers call the paradox of mystical knowledge. If mystical experiences provide genuine insight about reality, why can't that knowledge be translated into ordinary language or scientific concepts? Philosopher Stephen Katz argues that all mystical experiences are culturally constructed. Christians see Jesus, Buddhists experience emptiness because their brains interpret universal neural states through learned frameworks. But neuroscientist Dr. Sam Harris counters that the most profound mystical experiences transcend cultural conditioning entirely. When the default mode network, the source of cultural self-narrative, completely shuts down, what emerges might be consciousness encountering its own fundamental nature. This connects to philosopher Thomas Nagel's argument that consciousness contains aspects that can't be reduced to physical processes. Maybe mystical experiences aren't anomalies to be explained away. Maybe they're windows into the irreducible nature of consciousness itself. Which brings us to the most radical possibility. Here's what emerges when we synthesize this research. Mystical experiences might not be hallucinations or brain malfunctions. They might be the brain temporarily accessing the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, a philosopher and computer scientist, proposes what he calls analytical idealism, the idea that consciousness is the fundamental substrate of reality, and brains are reducing valves that normally filter this larger consciousness down to manageable, survival-focused awareness. From this perspective, mystical experiences occur when the reducing valve temporarily opens wider, allowing access to broader fields of consciousness that are always present but normally filtered out. This aligns with physicist Max Planck's famous statement, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness." Maybe mystical experiences are consciousness recognizing itself. The implications are staggering. If consciousness is fundamental to reality rather than emergent from brain activity, then mystical experiences aren't anomalies. They're glimpses of the actual structure of existence. But this raises the ultimate question. We're witnessing the birth of a new scientific paradigm. Major universities now have dedicated psychedelic research centers. The FDA is fast-tracking psilocybin and MDMA for therapeutic use. We're moving toward a science that takes mystical experience seriously. Dr. Matthew Johnson at Johns Hopkins is developing protocols for mystical experience therapy, using controlled mystical states to treat depression, addiction, and existential anxiety. Early results show success rates that exceed any existing treatment. But perhaps most significantly, this research is forcing us to reconsider the relationship between subjective experience and objective reality. If mystical experiences provide consistent, transformative insights that improve psychological well-being, can we still dismiss them as just brain chemistry? We might be approaching what Thomas Kuhn called a paradigm shift, a fundamental change in how we understand the nature of consciousness, reality, and human potential itself. So what does this mean for you personally? We're living at a unique moment in human history where mystical experience is becoming scientifically accessible and socially acceptable. But with that accessibility comes responsibility. If consciousness is indeed fundamental, and if mystical experiences provide genuine insight into reality's deeper structure, then cultivating these states might be one of the most important things a human being can do. But as we explored in our previous video, these territories require respect, preparation, and proper support. The next time you have what feels like a mystical experience, whether through meditation, in nature, or in moments of profound beauty, consider that you might not be hallucinating or having a brain malfunction. You might be accessing the deepest truth about what you actually are. Ask yourself, if consciousness is the foundation of reality, and if mystical experiences are consciousness recognizing itself, what does that mean for how you live your daily life, how you treat others, how you understand your own deepest nature? We started with a remarkable scientific discovery, that mystical experiences have universal neural signatures. We've seen how ancient wisdom traditions accurately mapped these states millennia before we could measure them. And we've explored the possibility that consciousness itself might be fundamental to reality. The convergence of neuroscience and mysticism isn't destroying the sacred. It's revealing that the sacred might be woven into the very fabric of existence. The question isn't whether mystical experiences are real. The question is what reality actually is. But if consciousness is evolving, and if we're part of that evolution, what new forms of mystical experience might be emerging? That's territory we'll explore next. I want to hear about your own mystical experiences, whether spontaneous, meditative, or otherwise. These comment sections often become some of the most profound conversations on the internet. And if this video expanded your understanding of what's possible for human consciousness, hit that like button and subscribe. We're exploring the very edge of what science and spirituality can reveal together. Next, dive into our investigation of consciousness and quantum physics. We're going even deeper into the mystery of what mind and reality actually are.